Hey guys, tonight we slip back into a world where shadows of power and whispers of romance drift through candlelit halls. Picture it. You're standing in a grand Tudor chamber, the scent of old wood and ink still hanging in the air, and every knock at the door could be a new suitor, hoping to win the most elusive queen in Europe. The tension is real behind the jeweled smiles are daggers. And if you think court life is glamorous, trust me, you wouldn't survive a single week in it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are sitting quietly, perhaps in your own room, and as you close your eyes you can almost hear the wind brushing against the window, carrying you back to the 16th century. The world you are stepping into is both dazzling like a cloth of gold and fragile like a thread stretched too thin. In that world, a little princess named Elizabeth is born under the proud gaze of her father, King Henry VIII, and the suspicious looks of half of Europe. Imagine it. You are only a few hours old, and already the entire world is arguing about whether you are legitimate. If this were today, the hashtag number Child of Controversy would be trending by sunrise. Elizabeth was born in the year 1533, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. That is the official. The recorded history. Her father broke with the Pope and the Catholic Church simply to marry her mother, creating a national religious earthquake. Picture it as a modern CEO suddenly announcing he is cutting ties with the parent corporation just because he wants to marry his secretary. Nobody thought it would work, yet somehow he pulled it off. And Europe reeled in shock. Here is a little-known fact. In her earliest years, Elizabeth was not exactly the darling of European courts. Unlike her half-sister Mary, who was promised to princes in France and even the Holy Roman Emperor, Elizabeth barely received a glance. Why? Because many believed she was the product of an unlawful marriage. At one point, the French king flatly rejected the idea of tying his son to her. If you imagine a dating app today, Elizabeth's profile would have read, "Father divorced the Pope. Mother executed. Future uncertain. Swipe left. Swipe left. Swipe left." Historians still argue about how Elizabeth was raised after her mother was executed. Some say she was pushed to the sidelines, neglected in the cold atmosphere of court. Others believe she was carefully educated and protected because, after all, she might still serve as a valuable spare card in the deck of succession. What do you think? A child of 2 years old, suddenly motherless, declared illegitimate. Could she still believe in the love of the adults around her? Her father soon married Jane Seymour, who gave birth to a little boy named Edward. For Elizabeth, that was both a joy and a warning bell. Joy, because the dynasty finally had a male heir. Warning, because she knew now that she herself was expendable. And so, from childhood, she honed a rare skill, the art of watching. You know how kids who grow up on the edge often become hyper-aware of every gesture, every look, every smile. Elizabeth learned to survive by noticing everything while speaking very little. Here's another curious piece. Elizabeth turned out to be an extraordinary student. She mastered Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, and could translate philosophy and theology as though she were a scholar. At the age of 10, she was already translating complex Greek texts into English. Be honest, at 10 years old, you were probably arguing over who got the game controller, not tackling Aristotle. But then came another unsettling chapter. At around 14, Elizabeth lived with Catherine Parr, the last wife of Henry VIII. Catherine's new husband, Thomas Seymour, was charming, ambitious, and terribly inappropriate. Records tell us he would enter Elizabeth's room early in the morning in nothing but his nightgown, tickling her, sometimes even slashing her dress with a sword as a joke. Today we would call that harassment. Back then, some laughed it off as playful teasing. You can almost sigh in disbelief. The royal court looked less like a palace and more like a family drama series on Netflix. At first, Catherine herself laughed. But when she walked in to see Thomas embracing Elizabeth, she realized it had gone too far. The princess was sent away. It was a turning point. Elizabeth learned, in her own body, that powerful men could be dangerous, and that marriage was a trap. Years later, when she declared she would never marry, you can trace that decision back to those mornings of unease in Catherine Parr's household. Historians still debate Elizabeth's role in that strange household drama. Was she an entirely innocent victim, a 14-year-old cornered by a 40-year-old man, or did she show signs of clever calculation, deliberately escaping the net? Opinions differ. What is certain is that she survived. And, trust me, surviving the Tudor court was no small feat. Honestly, you would not last even a single day in that snake pit. After her father died, Elizabeth watched as her young brother Edward VI became king at only 9 years old. He was frail, sickly, and entirely controlled by ambitious advisors. Elizabeth, on the other hand, had no direct power yet. But she was absorbing every move. Perhaps, deep inside, she was already whispering to herself one day, "If fortune ever hands me the crown, no one will rule in my place." Picture Elizabeth as a teenager, fiery red hair, pale skin, graceful posture, and eyes that missed nothing. She was not merely a sidelined princess. She was a dagger, disguised in velvet. Her childhood scars had sharpened her into someone who would never show her entire hand. And that was her greatest gift, the art of waiting, and of never letting anyone see her final card. And here is the twist. As a young girl, she was dismissed as unwanted, unworthy, almost forgotten. Yet as an adult, she became the woman every king, every prince, and every noble in Europe longed to marry. You know the story, the overlooked kid in school who shows up at the reunion 10 years later successful, radiant, and impossible to ignore. Elizabeth was the royal version of that transformation. You exhale softly, listening to the faint hum of your own fan. The journey of a queen does not begin on the throne. It begins in the shadows of childhood, in the lessons of loss, neglect, and survival. And when you close your eyes, you can almost see her, a little girl declared illegitimate, standing quietly in the corner of a cold Tudor hall, already learning how to outlive them all. You are still here, eyes half closed, and the hum of the room feels like the faint echo of church bells tolling somewhere far away. The story drifts forward, and you now find yourself in the uneasy years when Elizabeth's half-sister, Mary, wears the crown. Mary I, later called Bloody Mary by her enemies, was a woman in her late 30s with no children, noir, and a fire in her heart to restore Catholicism in England. For Elizabeth, this was both a blessing and a curse. A blessing, because if Mary remained childless, Elizabeth was next in line for the throne. A curse, because being Protestant in a time of Catholic revenge was like walking around with a target painted on your back. The official record is simple. After young King Edward VI died, the throne wavered between Lady Jane Grey and Mary Tudor. Mary, supported by the people, triumphed. Elizabeth, at 20 years old, suddenly became heir presumptive, the Protestant sister of a Catholic queen. It was like sitting in the front row of a play where you know the script ends with either applause or execution. Here's a curious fact. Not everyone knows at first. Mary tried to win Elizabeth over, even inviting her to court and showing her public affection. Some ambassadors wrote that Mary kissed her sister in front of everyone, calling her dear sister Elizabeth. But beneath those gestures lay tension as sharp as a hidden dagger. Each smile was lined with suspicion. Imagine hugging someone at a family dinner, while both of you secretly wonder who's about to poison the wine. Historians still debate the extent of Elizabeth's involvement in the Wyatt Rebellion of 1554. Sir Thomas Wyatt raised an army against Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain, hoping instead to place Elizabeth Protestant and young on the throne. Was Elizabeth secretly part of this? Some argue yes, pointing to her letters and her convenient position as an alternative queen. Others insist she was innocent, a pawn blamed by association. What is certain is that Mary did not trust her. Elizabeth was arrested, dragged through the rain to the Tower of London, and imprisoned in the same cold fortress where her mother, Anne Boleyn, had once awaited execution. Pause here for a moment. Can you feel that? The damp stone walls, the iron bars, the silence broken only by footsteps of guards. Elizabeth was 21, locked away, with death hanging just above her head. You can almost imagine her lying awake at night, thinking, "Will they come for me at dawn? Will the axe fall like it did on my mother?" And yet, she did not break. She answered every interrogation with careful words, never confessing, never accusing. If there is an Olympic sport for surviving political questioning, Elizabeth would have won gold. Here's where it gets strangely modern. While Elizabeth was inside the Tower, her childhood friend Robert Dudley was imprisoned too. He was the son of the Duke of Northumberland, who had tried to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne. Both Elizabeth and Robert, in separate cells, lived under the same threat of death. You almost want to imagine them exchanging glances through barred windows, silent promises in the dark. Years later, people would whisper about their intimacy, and maybe it all began with the bond of two young prisoners waiting for the axe. Mary, meanwhile, moved forward with her unpopular marriage to Philip of Spain. The English people hated the idea of being ruled by a foreigner, and riots broke out. Mary burned hundreds of Protestants at the stake, earning her bloody nickname. For Elizabeth, the fires were more than political, they were personal warnings. Each flame licked closer to her, reminding her that one slip, one rumor, one careless friend could send her to the pyre. You can almost hear her whisper to herself, "Stay still, stay silent, survive." And here's a little detail that rarely makes it into textbooks. Philip of Spain himself, after Mary's death, actually proposed to Elizabeth. Yes, the widower of her sister wanted to marry her. His reasoning was coldly political. Marrying Elizabeth would keep England under Spanish influence. Elizabeth, with that sharp wit of hers, politely declined. If Tinder existed back then, she would have swiped left faster than lightning. Historians argue endlessly about Elizabeth's religious position during Mary's reign. Was she truly committed to Protestantism? Or was she quietly flexible, willing to bend until she had the crown? Some letters suggest she feigned illness whenever she was expected to attend Catholic Mass. Clever tactic, who can argue with a fever? But was it genuine sickness? Or was Elizabeth simply playing the game? We may never know. Think for a moment about how this shapes her, a young woman learning, in the most dangerous environment, that silence could save her life. That patience was her strongest shield. If you lived in that court, you probably wouldn't survive more than a week. Between the bonfires of martyrs and the whispers of betrayal, you'd be booking a one-way ticket out of Tudor England. By the time Mary died at 42, likely of uterine cancer, Elizabeth had done what few could she endured. She kept her head, literally and politically, when so many others lost theirs. And so, when courtiers came to tell her she was now queen, they found her sitting beneath a great oak tree. She looked up at them, calm as dawn, and said, "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." And just like that, the girl once branded illegitimate, the prisoner once facing execution, was crowned Elizabeth, the first one of the most remarkable monarchs the world would ever know. You let your breath slow, the hum in your room melting into the imagined rustle of velvet gowns and the scrape of boots on palace stone. Elizabeth is queen now, and with the crown comes a new storm suitors. So many suitors. You picture it, her throne is less a seat of power and more like a dating app profile that the entire continent is swiping on. Kings, princes, dukes, and ambitious lords, each hoping to win her hand and, through it, the keys to England. The official history is clear in the early years of her reign. The question of marriage loomed like a thundercloud. Parliament begged her to choose a husband. Ambassadors lined up at her court, and poets wrote verses imagining the perfect royal wedding. Elizabeth, ever the strategist, dangled the possibility but never committed. It was her favourite game, keep everyone guessing. Start with the English nobles. They had the advantage of proximity, handsome courtiers who could flirt with her directly, kneeling at her side during dances, whispering words meant to sound like devotion but dripping with ambition. Take Henry Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel. He spent a fortune entertaining Elizabeth, hosting lavish feasts in hopes of impressing her. He imagined himself a king consort. But Elizabeth saw through him. She smiled. She teased. And then she ghosted him. Centuries before texting existed, she had already perfected the art of leaving someone on read. Later, Arundel would even be caught in a plot against her life. So yes, good instincts, Your Majesty. Then there was William Pickering Tall, handsome, with a reputation as a charmer of ladies. For a time, ambassadors whispered that Elizabeth might marry him. But when he finally arrived at court, she cooled, shrugged, and sent him back north. Imagine spending weeks preparing your best outfit, rehearsing your best lines, only to discover the Queen wasn't interested after all. Awkward. Now the foreigners, kings and princes from across Europe, sent gifts, letters, and portraits. Eric XIV of Sweden sent ambassadors with promises and poetry. Frederick II of Denmark tried to outshine him with displays of power. Charles of Austria came with an offer carefully brokered by the Holy Roman Emperor. Even Henri of France, young, sharp-tongued, and frankly rude, was briefly considered, if only to irritate Spain. And then there was François, Duke of Anjou, who called Elizabeth his frog and wrote her letters so steamy they could probably fog the palace windows. Here's the quirky detail most people don't know. Elizabeth loved a man's legs. Yes, legs. She inherited it from her father, Henry VIII, who had once been admired for his own shapely calves. At court, nobles angled to show off their legs in fine hose, strutting like peacocks. And Elizabeth, she noticed. Imagine the Tudor version of posting gym selfies. Historians still argue over Elizabeth's intentions. Did she ever truly consider marriage to any of these men? Or was she simply playing diplomacy? Some claim she nearly married the Duke of Anjou, even giving him a ring to seal their betrothal. Others say she always knew she would never marry, using her suitors as pawns to balance power between France and Spain. The debate continues, with no final answer. What is certain is this: Elizabeth kept the world dangling. Every proposal was a string she could pull to negotiate alliances, prevent war, or buy time. By never saying yes, she avoided the dangers that came with sharing her throne and her bed. Clever, Absolutely. Frustrating for the men, without a doubt. If you think ghosting one person is hard, imagine ghosting half of Europe. Pause and picture it. Her court buzzing with gossip, ambassadors pacing in frustration, and Elizabeth sitting on her throne, smiling serenely. Her silence was louder than any word, her hesitation more powerful than any promise. And through it all, she remained untouchable. The Virgin Queen, dazzling, elusive, and always one step ahead. And you? Listening now, he can almost hear her laughter echo through the great halls. A queen who turned suitors into tools, who turned flirtation into politics, who knew that saying no was often the greatest power of all. You sink a little deeper into your chair, the soft hum of the room around you, almost becoming the sound of hushed whispers in a candlelit chamber. For all the grand suitors and dazzling proposals, there was really only one man whose name seemed stitched into Elizabeth's heart, Robert Dudley. If the parade of foreign princes was a stage show, Dudley was the secret performance behind the curtain. The official history is steady on this point, from the very first days of her reign. Elizabeth raised Robert close. She made him Master of the Horse, a position that kept him at her side, constantly organizing her travels, her stables, even her coronation procession. It was the kind of job that demanded physical closeness, and court observers noticed. Soon the rumour mill spun wildly, the young queen and her dashing courtier, inseparable, laughing, whispering, dancing late into the night. Ambassadors wrote home with suspicion, noble shot, jaloux glance. Everyone was asking the same question. Were they lovers? Here's the odd little detail. Elizabeth arranged for Dudley's chambers to be right next to her own, supposedly connected by a secret passage. Whether that passage was real or exaggerated, the symbolism alone was scandalous. To quiet suspicions, Elizabeth even paid a servant to stay in Dudley's room as a kind of chaperone. But of course, servants can be bribed to look away at the right time. Imagine a sitcom scene where the chaperone sneaks out for a sandwich, just as the Queen tiptoes in awkward, doesn't even begin to cover it. Historians still debate the truth. Some argue Elizabeth and Dudley had a physical relationship, pointing to her mysterious illness in 1561 that left her body swollen, perhaps pregnancy. They suggest. Others insist it was smallpox or another malady, and that Elizabeth was too careful, too aware of her reputation, to risk intimacy. After all, if proof of an affair or, worse, a secret child ever surfaced, her legitimacy as queen could shatter overnight. To this day, the debate lingers, unresolved, like a candle flame flickering in a draught. And then there's the tragedy of Amy Robsart, Dudley's wife. She was found dead at the bottom of a staircase in 1560, her neck broken. An inquest ruled it an accident, but few believed it. Whispers of murder circled the court had Dudley arranged her death, hoping to marry the Queen. Whether true or not, the scandal made it impossible for Elizabeth to wed him. To marry Dudley now would have looked like a confession of guilt. So instead, she kept him close, but always just out of reach. You can almost imagine her heart tugging one way, her crown tugging another. Here's a detail most people miss. Elizabeth often reassured Dudley that, if she ever married, it would be him. That promise kept him loyal, hopeful, and forever waiting. At the same time, she never followed through. Was it cruelty? Was it strategy? Or was it her own fear of repeating the tragedies she'd witnessed in her father's marriages? Their bond grew stranger still when Elizabeth suggested Dudley should marry Mary, Queen of Scots, and that their child could inherit both kingdoms. You can almost laugh. Imagine telling the man you love, "Why don't you marry my rival and we'll all live together?" Unsurprisingly, Dudley refused, and Mary married elsewhere, disastrously. Through it all, Dudley loved Elizabeth with a devotion that feels both touching and heartbreaking. He turned down noble princesses, offered to him by foreign courts, stayed by Elizabeth's side for decades, and entertained her at his grand estate of Kenilworth with pageants, music, and even mechanical dolphins that floated on the moat. Picture that Elizabeth, wrapped in silks, smiling as a giant papier-mâché dolphin drifts by with musicians strumming on its back. It sounds like the Renaissance version of a Vegas show, but there was pain too. Dudley eventually remarried secretly to Lettice Knollys, a woman said to resemble Elizabeth. When the Queen discovered the marriage, she was furious, heartbroken, and banished Lettice from court. Yet she could never let go of Dudley himself. He remained the one constant companion of her life. Even when he died of cancer in 1588, she locked herself in her chambers for days, refusing to eat, and kept his final letter beside her bed until her own death years later. Think about it in a world where Elizabeth never let men define her. Dudley was the exception she could not entirely deny. Maybe they were lovers. Maybe they were not. Maybe it was passion restrained. Maybe it was friendship so intense that it blurred into something more. The truth is sealed away, hidden in the silence they carried to the grave. And as you breathe slowly now, you can almost hear their story echo a queen and her favourite, walking a line between power and love, torn between what the heart wanted and what the crown demanded. Mystery wrapped in devotion, scandal wrapped in silence. And perhaps that is why, even a century later, we lean closer, still trying to guess what happened when the doors closed and the candles dimmed. You let your eyes drift closed for a moment, as though the air itself is softer now. The long road of Elizabeth's life has nearly reached its end, and you can feel the weight of years pressing down on her shoulders. She is no longer the fiery young princess hiding from danger, no longer the flirtatious queen surrounded by suitors and whispers. She is the virgin queen, older, wiser, still radiant, and standing alone at the centre of her own legend. The official history tells us this Elizabeth reigned for 45 years, guiding England through what became known as a golden age. It was an era of peace compared to the chaos that came before, an age of explorers and poets, of theatres bursting with the words of Shakespeare, of seafarers like Francis Drake circling the globe. Against the thunder of the Spanish Armada, her navy triumphed. Against assassination plots and rebellion, she endured. She had no husband, no children, but she had her crown. And she wore it longer and more steadily than almost any monarch of her time. Here's a curious, lesser-known detail. Elizabeth sometimes referred to her kingdom itself as her child. She spoke of nurturing it, caring for it, sacrificing for it, as though the bond of motherhood had shifted from the personal to the national. It was her way of transforming absence into strength. No heir in flesh, but an heir in culture, in stability, in the idea of England itself. It's a little like someone today saying, "I never had kids, but I raised an entire company, an entire movement." And in Elizabeth's case, she raised a nation. Historians still argue over whether Elizabeth's choice to remain single was a stroke of genius or a tragedy. Did her refusal to marry save England from foreign domination and keep her firmly in control? Or did it leave the Tudor line vulnerable, forcing the crown to pass to the Stuarts after her death? Even now, there is no final verdict. Some see her as a hero of independence, others as a queen who denied her people the security of an heir. The truth, as always, sits in between both brilliant and imperfect. Close your eyes and imagine her in her later years, her face painted pale with white lead, her wigs heavy with jewels, her gowns shimmering with embroidery. Beneath the spectacle was a woman haunted by time. She knew her youth was long gone, her beauty fading. Her closest companions, Robert Dudley, Francis Walsingham, already dead. Courtiers still flattered her. Young men still flirted in hopes of rising at court. But she was tired. She leaned on ritual, on ceremony, on the rhythm of pageantry to hold herself together. And yet, even in those final years, Elizabeth remained sharp. When she gave her famous speech to the troops at Tilbury as the Spanish Armada approached, she declared, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." Imagine hearing those words from a woman in her 50s, riding out in armor among her soldiers, her voice carrying over the sea breeze. Goosebumps. Right. But time wins in the end. By 69 years old, Elizabeth was frail, weary, and unable to name a successor aloud. When she died in the year 1603, courtiers rushed to inform James VI of Scotland that he was now also James I of England. The Tudor line was gone. Yet Elizabeth's image majestats, untouchable, and fiercely independent remained. Here's the strange thing Elizabeth kept. Robert Dudley's last letter locked away in a box by her bedside until the very end. She may have ruled alone, but she never entirely let go of him. It's a tender reminder that even the most powerful queen carried private aches, hidden loves, and memories that no crown could erase. And so you sit here, listening, breathing, as the story settles. What is her legacy? Perhaps it is this. Elizabeth proved that power could belong to a woman, that a single person's will could hold a country together, that sometimes saying no to marriage, to compromise, to surrender, was itself the bravest choice. She left no child, but she left England stronger. She left no dynasty, but she left a legend. Even now, more than 4 centuries later, we whisper about her suitors, her secrets, her silences. We wonder whether she ever let herself love fully, whether she truly lived as the Virgin Queen or only performed it for the sake of politics. We may never know, and maybe that's the point. Mystery was her final weapon, and she wielded it well. Breathe deeply. Let the hum of your room carry you. The story of Elizabeth has ended, but her shadow lingers like candlelight that refuses to go out, like a crown resting not on her head anymore, but in the memory of all who still speak her name. You let your mind drift a little slower now, and this time we turn toward another side of Elizabeth, one not always wrapped in the familiar image of the Virgin Queen. This is the part that official chronicles often underplay: Elizabeth's relationship with her ordinary people, and the way she touched their daily lives. The official record shows us that throughout her long reign, Elizabeth regularly embarked on Progress's royal tours, where the entire court travelled across the countryside, so the Queen could be seen by her subjects. For the royal treasury, these journeys were a burden feeding, and housing hundreds of courtiers was no small expense. But for villagers, it was a once-in-a-lifetime moment to see the Queen's horse pass by, to smell the perfume of nobles mingled with hay and rain, to watch the banners streaming in the wind. Some accounts even describe peasants weeping openly just because Elizabeth smiled and waved in their direction. Here's the curious, lesser-known detail: Elizabeth was a master of what we'd now call public image. She would often linger in doorways or on balconies just long enough for the crowds to catch a glimpse. She chose gowns of bright colours, so she stood out even against the grey London skies. Some chroniclers even suggest she deliberately crafted herself into a kind of stage presence, less a politician, more a living icon. If she had social media today, she would have been a master of Instagram reels, always knowing the perfect angle, The perfect lighting, the perfect moment to captivate an audience. Historians still debate whether this bond was heartfelt or calculated. Some argue Elizabeth genuinely loved her people, seeing them as her great family, especially since she had no husband and no children of her own. Others insist it was deliberate theatre. She knew the affection of her subjects was the strongest shield against assassins, rebels, or foreign invasion. The truth, as with much of her life, probably lies somewhere in between, part sincerity, part brilliant performance. Close your eyes and picture it, a small village. People pressing together under a fine drizzle of rain, and then a golden carriage rolling to a stop. Elizabeth steps down, her cloak of crimson catching the light, her face pale with powder, her lips curved in a smile. No one knows if she feels weary, lonely, or calculating in that moment, but the crowd believes they see their mother, their sovereign, their protector, and that belief alone secures her throne more firmly than any marriage alliance ever could. You hear the faint whisper of wind outside your window, and you picture, somewhere across the English countryside, a cloud of dust rising from a dirt road, the sign that the Queen's entourage is arriving. This isn't a grand ceremony in a gilded hall, it's one of Elizabeth's long royal progresses. She doesn't stay locked away in London. Instead, she brings her entire court roaming from town to town, letting her people catch a glimpse of their sovereign. Villagers crowd along the roadside, pressing shoulder to shoulder, all hoping to tell their children and grandchildren, "I saw her with my own eyes." Stories spread that in the midst of these crowds, Elizabeth didn't just wave mechanically. At times, she stopped her horse, leaned down, and asked a child a question or two. "Can you read yet, or does your family grow barley?" Simple words. But for a farmer's household, they were treasures to keep for life. Imagine being that small child, lifted up before the Queen, asked something so ordinary yet unforgettable. That memory would echo through the family for generations. And it is from moments like these that debate has stirred ever since. Some insist Elizabeth truly cared for her people, that because she had no husband and no children, the nation itself became her family. Others argue it was all theatre, carefully staged an outdoor performance of public relations before PR had a name. A few smiles, a few gentle gestures, enough to secure her image as the nurturing mother of her realm. What do you think? Was it a warm heart at work? Or a sharp political mind? Perhaps both layered together, like white lead paint hiding wrinkles under a crimson smile. You let your own breath slow, and you imagine the scene. A golden carriage halts in the middle of a village. Elizabeth steps down, her scarlet cloak glowing in the sunlight, her face powdered pale, her lips curving into a practiced smile. No one knows if she is weary, calculating, or simply enjoying herself. But the villagers see only one thing: their queen remembering them, looking at them with the gaze of a mother, and that alone is enough to hold the throne steadier than any marriage alliance ever could. You let the air drift in and out of your chest, and this time the scene is no longer a village lane, it is a crowded playhouse. The scent of sawdust and candle smoke rising as the stage comes alive, because if Elizabeth ruled her nobles with politics and her people with presence, she ruled the soul of her nation with culture. The official chronicles tell us her reign gave birth to England's great flowering of art, the poetry of Spenser, the music of Tallis and Bird, and of course, the plays of William Shakespeare. But the story is not just about names on a page, it's about how a queen understood the power of imagination. Elizabeth made herself the ultimate muse. She allowed poets to paint her as a goddess, playwrights to allude to her as a wise ruler, and musicians to weave her into their harmonies. Every performance was not just entertainment, it was propaganda wrapped in beauty. And here's a delightful detail. Few remember Elizabeth loved masks and pageants so much that she often joined in the banter herself. There's a record of her quipping back to actors during a performance, throwing the audience into laughter. Imagine being at the Globe Theatre, and suddenly the Queen heckles a line like a royal version of live comedy improv. If Twitter had existed, the hashtag #QueenGotJokes would have trended instantly. Yet historians continue to debate whether Elizabeth truly cherished the arts for their own sake, or whether she mainly saw them as a stage to polish her image. Was she genuinely enchanted by Shakespeare's lines? Or did she simply recognize how cleverly they elevated her reign? Some believe she kept poets close out of real affection for their craft, while others argue she used them as carefully as she used her courtiers, rewarding loyalty, punishing defiance, shaping the narrative of her rule. Picture her court during a performance, nobles shifting in jeweled gowns, torches flickering on painted scenery, and Elizabeth seated on a raised chair, her face a pale mask of powder. The actors speak, and though the play is about Roman generals or fairy kings, everyone knows it is also about her. Each story whispered her virtues, each chorus underlined her power, and Elizabeth, sharp-eyed, would laugh or sigh in all the right places, letting the message sink in. There's another curious anecdote. It's said that Shakespeare's play A Midsummer Night's Dream was performed for her, and that she adored the mischievous fairy Puck. Some even claim she requested a play showing the adventures of Falstaff in love, simply because she enjoyed the bumbling knight. Think about that. A queen who could order up new content, the way we now click next episode on Netflix. Power has its perks, and yet, beneath the theatre and music, there was something deeply human. Elizabeth understood that image could not live on ceremony alone. To survive in a world of daggers and doubts, she needed stories. Stories that made her more than a mortal woman. Stories that cast her as eternal. In that sense, the artists of her age were not just entertainers. They were her shield, her crown, her immortal echo. So, as you breathe in the quiet of your own room, you can almost hear the distant applause of a Tudor playhouse, and in its glow, the soft rustle of a queen's gown. Elizabeth sits, smiling at the performance, knowing that long after the torches burn out, the words, the music, the myths will keep her alive. And perhaps that is the greatest performance of all. You let your breath settle, and this time the picture shifts. No more village crowds or candlelit theatres. Now you are in a private chamber, where Elizabeth sits at a heavy wooden desk, surrounded by letters, maps, and worn quills. Here we glimpse another side of her, not the virgin queen adored by her people, nor the patron of poets, but a woman deeply obsessed with how she appeared and how history would remember her. The chronicles tell us clearly Elizabeth controlled portraiture more tightly than any ruler before her. Every painting of her had to be approved, every face carefully smoothed, every wrinkle erased. By decree, artists had to follow authorized patterns to ensure her features remained forever youthful and luminous. That is why we so often see Elizabeth with alabaster skin, brilliant eyes, and flaming hair, even when she was in her 50s or 60s. In modern terms, you could call it the ultimate permanent filter applied not with an app, but with brush and pigment. Here's a little-known twist. Elizabeth adored hidden symbols woven into her portraits. Sun and moon motifs embroidered on her gowns, eyes subtly painted into her sleeves, pearls scattered across her bodices. Each detail whispered a message. She was the guiding light, the all-seeing ruler, the eternal virgin. Think of it as the Tudor version of political emojis, stitched right into silk and lace, so that every subject who looked upon her could decode the silent propaganda. And yet historians still debate. Did Elizabeth truly believe she was a divine figure? Or was she simply using these symbols as tools to survive in a male-dominated world? Some argue she cultivated an almost religious cult of virginity, elevating herself into myth. Others insist she was perfectly pragmatic, knowing full well that dressing like a goddess was the sharpest shield against doubt. The truth is likely a blend both woman and symbol, both weary human and immortal image. Imagine walking into a grand hall. On every wall hang portraits of Elizabeth radiant, ageless, imperious. Then, in a quiet corner, you glimpse the Queen herself, a thin frame, tired eyes behind the mask of white lead powder, two Elizabeths coexisting at once, the painted legend and the fragile woman beneath. It becomes clear she ruled not only with laws and armies, but with the careful curation of her own story. Her legacy was not just a dynasty, but an image crafted so perfectly that centuries later, we still whisper her name with awe. And as you lie back now, listening to the soft hum of your own room, you realize that Elizabeth's greatest weapon may not have been her navy or her spies, but her ability to make people believe in a queen larger than life. A queen who could be mother, goddess, and sovereign all at once. A queen who refused to let anyone else write her story, so she wrote it herself. In paint, in music, in theatre, and in the white dust of her carefully powdered face, you feel yourself sinking a little deeper. The quiet of your own room, now turning into the solemn hush of a candlelit chapel. This is another layer of Elizabeth's story, her relationship with faith, with God, and with the dangerous tangle of religion in her time. The official history is clear. When Elizabeth came to the throne, England was torn apart by decades of religious upheaval. Her father Henry had broken from Rome. Her brother Edward had pushed Protestant reform, and her sister Mary had burned Protestants at the stake to drag the country back to Catholicism. By the time Elizabeth became queen, the nation was exhausted, anxious, and fragile. Everyone wanted to know, would she be Catholic Protestant, or something else entirely? Elizabeth's answer was brilliantly slippery. She established what we now call the Elizabethan religious settlement. England would be Protestant in form, with the Queen as supreme governor of the Church. But services kept many Catholic traditions, robes, music, incense. It was a balancing act, a tightrope over fire. To the Catholics, she wasn't Catholic enough. To the Puritans, she was far too Catholic. Yet somehow, her middle way held the kingdom together. Here's a curious detail that slips under the radar. Elizabeth hated long sermons. She found them tedious, and would often fidget or whisper jokes to her courtiers while preachers droned on. Imagine being a clergyman pouring out your heart, and the Queen of England is whispering in the pews like a bored schoolgirl. If phones had existed, she probably would have been scrolling Instagram. And yet historians still argue, was Elizabeth personally devout? Or was religion for her mostly politics? Some point to her private prayers, carefully worded and preserved, as proof of sincere faith. Others say her cool pragmatism, her refusal to persecute Catholics en masse. Her tolerance of variety in worship shows she used faith more as a shield than a flame. Perhaps both are true. A woman who believed, yes, but also a ruler who understood belief, could topple thrones if not handled with care. Picture her during a royal chapel service, the choir swelling with sacred music, incense curling like smoke from a slow fire, and Elizabeth kneeling in her heavy gown. Did her mind wander to diplomacy, to Spain and France, even as she bowed her head? Or did she, in those fleeting moments, feel something like peace? No one can say. What we know is that she always kept her faith veiled, never too fiery, Never too cold. Just enough. There is another story when pressed by an ambassador to declare exactly what she believed. She smiled and said, "I have no desire to make windows into men's souls." A simple line, but radical for her age. It meant she would not police belief itself, only outward conformity. For a 16th century monarch, that was as close to religious freedom as you could hope for. So, as you listen to the quiet around you now, you might realize this was Elizabeth's true genius, not in choosing a side, but in refusing to let sides destroy her. Her faith was a tapestry of compromise, woven from silk and shadow, and in that balance, she found a way to keep her kingdom from tearing itself apart. You breathe slowly, and now the room around you becomes the dim, echoing corridors of a palace in winter. The Queen is older, her steps a little slower, the air heavy with the scent of powder and perfume. This is Elizabeth. In her final years, the woman who once dazzled Europe with youth and wit, now wrestling with something no crown can command the march of time. History tells us that Elizabeth reigned until 69 years old, far older than most of her contemporaries. In those last decades, she clung to ritual and ceremony, surrounding herself with jewels, wigs, and gowns so ornate that they seemed more like armor than clothing. Every public appearance became a performance of immortality. She knew the eyes of ambassadors and courtiers would measure every wrinkle, every tremor, and so she built layers, pearls, silks, lead powder, until her body itself became a stage set. Here's a curious detail. Rarely mentioned, she kept dozens of wigs, each labeled and catalogued, so she could choose the hair color and style that suited the occasion. Red for defiance, gold for celebration, black for mourning. It was like curating a personal brand centuries before the term existed. And she refused, absolutely refused, to let anyone see her without them. Servants wrote of how she even guarded her dressing chambers as though they were state secrets. Historians still debate how much of this was vanity and how much was strategy. Was she terrified of being seen as frail, clinging desperately to the illusion of youth? Or was she, ever the politician, using her appearance to reassure her people that the Virgin Queen remained unshaken? Some argue she feared the whispers of age because age meant weakness, and weakness meant plots. Others believe she simply could not let go of the persona she had spent a lifetime building. Imagine standing in her presence during those twilight years, a figure glittering with diamonds, her face painted a ghostly white, lips crimson, eyes still, sharp. To some, she looked majestic, untouchable, like a living icon. To others, she appeared almost spectral, a reminder that beneath the glory was a mortal body, resisting its own decline. One courtier whispered that her presence was more a vision than a woman. There is another anecdote, strange, and telling Elizabeth refused to go to bed unless fully dressed and painted, fearing she might die in her sleep and be discovered unfinished. Even the prospect of death was filtered through image control. Think of it as the 16th century version of, "Don't take my picture until I'm ready." And yet, despite the exhaustion, she held on fiercely to her throne. She outlived her advisors, her rivals, even her favorites. Each death left her more isolated, more melancholy. In her final months, she stood for hours, refusing to lie down, as if afraid that surrendering to rest would mean surrendering to mortality. Servan described her leaning against cushions, silent, her fingers tight around Robert Dudley's last letter, which she had kept for years. So you breathe in, and you realize Elizabeth's battle at the end was not against Spain or Parliament, but against time itself, against the fading of beauty, the loss of companions, the inevitability of silence. And though she could not win, she did what she had always done. She turned the struggle into theatre. She let the world see not her weakness, but her spectacle. And perhaps that is why, even now, when we speak of the Virgin Queen, we do not picture her old and frail. We picture her radiant, commanding, eternal. The image outlived the woman, just as she intended. You let the stillness deepen, and now the air feels heavier, as though you are standing in a chamber where history itself is holding its breath. Elizabeth is gone, or almost gone. The woman who once danced in glittering halls, who laughed at plays, who stared down kings, now sits silent, her crown resting nearby, no longer needed. The official chronicles say she died in the year 1603, at the age of 69, after more than 4 decades on the throne. She left no husband, nor child, no heir of her body. And so, with her death, the Tudor line ended. Courtier, ever practical, rushed north to tell James of Scotland that he was now King of England too. It was a moment of quiet revolution, the age of one dynasty closing like a book, the first page of another, already turning. Here's a detail less often remembered in her last days. Elizabeth refused to sleep in a bed. She sat for hours, propped on cushions, eyes distant, as though lying down would be to surrender. Some thought she was haunted by visions, old faces, lost loves, perhaps even her mother, Anne Boleyn. Others whispered. She simply feared, dying unprepared. Her image unfinished. Imagine her chamber then, tapestries heavy with dust, candle burning low, and the Queen upright, a frail shadow of her painted portraits. And yet historians still wrestle with the question, how should we read her end? Was it a lonely, tragic finale for a woman who gave everything to her throne? Or was it the fitting close of a queen who had always chosen sovereignty over comfort? Some see melancholy in her silence. Others see defiance. Even at the threshold of death, Elizabeth left space for interpretation just as she had in life. Picture the transition itself. Messengers riding hard through the spring countryside, carrying the news to James VI of Scotland. The Queen is dead. Long live the King. For ordinary villagers, it must have been unsettling. Their mother queen, the only monarch many had ever known, was suddenly gone. Some wept in the streets, others lit candles, whispering prayers. The Virgin Queen had promised permanence through her image, and yet now she was dust. A curious note, though, Elizabeth had always refused to name a successor aloud. Her counsellors later claimed she gestured toward James in her final hours. Whether true or fabricated, that gesture became part of the myth, smoothing over what might have been a dangerous moment of uncertainty. Even in death, her story was polished. And so, as the coffin was carried through London, draped in black velvet, thousands pressed forward to see. Bells tolled, voices murmured. And yet there was also pride, for they knew she had left them more than a corpse. She had left them an identity. Under Elizabeth, England had survived invasion, discovered new worlds, written timeless plays. She had not given them children of her own, but she had given them a sense of themselves. You breathe, and in the hush, you can almost hear the muffled drums of that funeral procession. You see the crown resting on a cushion, ready to pass to new hands. Elizabeth's reign had ended, but her legend had only just begun. She was gone, yet still present, like a candle's afterglow, long after the flame is snuffed out. You take another slow breath, and the story does not end with Elizabeth's last heartbeat. In many ways, her death was only the beginning of something else, the careful weaving of memory, myth, and legend that would stretch across centuries. What remains after a queen is gone? For Elizabeth, it was not children, nor dynasties of blood. It was stories. The official accounts describe how, once her coffin had been lowered into Westminster Abbey, sermons and poems began to multiply. Preachers praised her as the saviour of Protestant England. Poets crowned her the Gloriana of a golden age. Even artists, who had painted her alive with youth and fire, now painted her in memory, as if she had transcended mortality. A woman had died, but an icon had been born. Here's something curious. Often overlooked in the years after her passing, ballads about Elizabeth were sung in taverns and marketplaces, not just in noble halls. Ordinary people who had once caught a glimpse of her on Progress now told grandchildren, "I saw her eyes, and they were brighter than the sun." Memory turned into exaggeration. Exaggeration into folklore. Within a generation, she had become part queen, part legend, something closer to a saint than a sovereign. And yet historians keep circling back to the same puzzle: how much of Elizabeth's image was built by her, and how much was constructed after her death. Some argue she consciously staged every detail, planting the seeds of a cult that would flower once she was gone. Others believe posterity reshaped her, sanding away the cracks, turning a shrewd, sometimes ruthless politician into a near-perfect heroine. The debate itself is telling, because it shows Elizabeth still holds power. She still refuses to be pinned down, even in history books. Imagine London decades later, a new dynasty on the throne. Fashions changing, new wars brewing. And yet, in theatres, in poems, in paintings, Elizabeth's shadow keeps returning. She is invoked when people long for stability. She is remembered whenever the nation dreams of a golden time. In this way, she continues to reign long after the crown has passed to another head. There is another strange detail. Some communities began to treat her birthday like a festival, lighting bonfires and drinking in her honour, even as the Stuart kings tried to promote their own image, to celebrate a queen after her death, against the pull of a new monarch that says something. It suggests the Virgin Queen had become more than a ruler. She had become a symbol of Englishness itself. So now, as you lie here, you might realise Elizabeth's greatest legacy was not simply the England she left behind, but the way she taught her people to imagine themselves. She offered them a story of resilience, of wit, of a woman who chose crown over marriage, state over self, image over intimacy. A story strong enough to be retold for 4 centuries and more. And in the stillness of your own room, you can almost hear the echo of that story whispered in ballads, painted in portraits, rising from the boards of the Globe Theatre. Elizabeth is gone, but she is still here. Not as flesh, not as bone, but as the myth she always wanted to be. A flame that refuses to die, glowing quietly, endlessly, in the dark. You lie still, listening to the soft whir of the fan, and let me take you into another layer of memory. As old as the dust clinging to the vaults of Westminster, Elizabeth did not just leave an empty throne when she closed her eyes. She left a hollow space in the mind of a nation, and that space was quickly filled, not by a successor of her body, but by stories, myths, and coats of legend painted over and over by time. Picture the morning after her funeral. London fog thick as wool, church bells tolling endlessly. In the markets, people clustered in whispers. The golden age has ended. Some wept, some stayed silent. But strangely, almost no one spoke of Elizabeth as flesh and blood. They did not say, "She was old and weary." Instead they said, "She will live forever, like the sun above us." You see, in just one night, a woman had become a myth. The official accounts say that almost immediately after her burial at Westminster Abbey, sermons and poems poured forth. Preachers hailed her as Estrella, the goddess of justice returning to the heavens. Poets called her Gloriana, the eternal glory of England. Playwrights staged works that hinted her reign had been a golden age. It was as though a vast campaign of memory had begun. But it was not manufactured. People themselves needed a symbol large enough to contain their grief. Here is something curious, often overlooked in taverns, alongside bawdy songs and ballads of war. Wandering singers performed verses about Elizabeth. It wasn't only courtiers who praised her, but common folk too. They recalled glimpses of her passing through their villages, the smile she gave to a child, and turned those moments into communal songs. Memory was carried in music. Folklore was built note by note. Historians still argue, did Elizabeth deliberately plant the seeds of her myth, or was it simply the gift of posterity? One side insists she consciously curated her image, from portraits to speeches, knowing it would outlive her. The other insists it was collective nostalgia, not her planning, that elevated her. Whichever view you choose, the result is the same. Elizabeth stepped out of life and into legend. Now consider her successor, James. I sat on the throne, determined to prove himself, yet no matter what he did, people compared him to the Queen who had gone before. It was like releasing a new song while the audience only wanted to replay the old hit. For James, it was a burden. For Elizabeth, even in death, it was power. There is a peculiar detail in certain rural communities. People lit bonfires on Elizabeth's birthday years after her death. Even though the new Stuart monarchy discouraged it, it showed that her memory had slipped beyond politics into something closer to devotion. To them, Elizabeth was not just a queen of history, but a protective spirit of the land. Picture it: a dark village square, a fire blazing, faces glowing in orange light, and songs rising into the night sky. Though Elizabeth lay in her tomb, she was present there through voices, through laughter, through the belief that their mother had not abandoned them. Writers, too, kept her alive. Playwrights crafted powerful female figures, sharp, commanding, clever as echoes of her presence. Some scholars point to Shakespeare's Titania, the fairy queen in A Midsummer Night's Dream, as a faint silhouette of Elizabeth. Others note that even bumbling Falstaff's antics were shaped by her request for new tales. In this way, theatre and poetry became mirrors, holding on to her light, long after palace candles had burned out. Modern scholars still debate, is the Virgin Queen we remember today a faithful image of the woman herself, or a 400-year PR campaign? Some insist she really was steadfast, boldly choosing sovereignty over marriage. Others remind us that she was human, with frailties and longings, only concealed too well. It is like a portrait layered with paint, the golden surface hiding darker sketches beneath. Now imagine yourself in London today. You walk past her statue, gaze up, and you do not just see carved stone. You see the memory of millions who once called her their queen. Each century has added another brushstroke, another interpretation. One age called her Gloriana, another judged her as a shrewd politician. And yet, through every shift, her name has never vanished. And perhaps that is the eternity Elizabeth craved, not a child in flesh, but a place in memory. A memory that refuses to lie still, always being retold, always being questioned, but never forgotten. You listen to the fans hum, like distant hoofbeat, and see it clearly. Elizabeth no longer sits on the throne, but she lingers in songs, in plays, in portrait, in whispered stories. A flame extinguished, yes, but the afterglow of that flame still warms the centuries, reaching all the way into your quiet room tonight. You let yourself rest, the sound of your own room humming gently, and now it is time to drift into the ending of this journey. Elizabeth's story, long and winding, comes to its close. Though her shadow lingers far beyond the grave, you have followed her from the fiery-haired child, uncertain and declared illegitimate, to the imprisoned young woman staring at the walls of the tower, to the queen who commanded nations and defied kings. And now you arrive at the quiet after the music, the silence after the drums, where all that remains is memory. Breathe in slowly, and picture her in those final days. No more dancing at court, no more dazzled princes vying for her hand, only a frail woman sitting at her table, surrounded by old letters, portraits, and the last note from Robert Dudley, which she kept close until her final breath. In that stillness you see Elizabeth not as a goddess or symbol, but as a human being who had loved, lost, and guarded her heart behind walls of ceremony. The Virgin Queen. Yes, but also a woman of secrets, unspoken sorrows, and tenderness that history can never fully capture. When you close your eyes, you can almost hear the muffled beat of funeral drums as her coffin passed through London. Crowds pressed together, some weeping, some silent, all whispering the same thing. She was our mother. Not goddess, not idol, but mother. For 45 years, she had turned a kingdom into a family, and herself into its memory. And yet, death was not the end. James ascended. The Tudor line ended, but Elizabeth's name continued to shimmer. Poets still called her Gloriana. Ballads were sung in taverns. Bonfires were lit on her birthday, years after she was gone. Even as the Stuart kings tried to assert themselves, people still longed for her reign. Her absence became presence. Her silence became song. Consider it. She had no children of flesh, yet left behind countless children of memory, ordinary villagers who swore they saw her smile once, artists who painted her as moonlight, sunlight, eternal virgin, generations who whispered her name as if it were a prayer. No dynasty of blood, but a dynasty of legend. And historians still debate, was she truly the Virgin Queen? Or was it only a political mask? Did she believe herself divine? Or only wield symbols like armor? Did she ever love Dudley as deeply as rumor suggests? The fact that we cannot answer keeps her alive. A ruler defined too neatly fades into textbooks. A ruler wrapped in mystery never leaves the stage. So take another breath. Slow and steady. Elizabeth's story tells you that immortality does not require perfection. It requires the ability to turn pain into power, loneliness into fire, fragility into something others can believe in. That is why we still whisper her name, not as a fact, but as a flame. And as you drift now towards sleep, let the last image be a candle trembling in a dark chamber. Its glow faint but steady. Elizabeth is gone, but the afterlight remains warm, golden, eternal. She lives on in the smile of villagers remembered in song, in the pages of plays, in the painted faces that still watch us across centuries. And tonight, in your dreams, close your eyes. Let the hum of the fan become the wind over the Thames. Let your breath join the breath of history. Elizabeth has gone, but her story continues, and you are now part of those who carry it forward. In this way, through every night, through every whispered retelling, she still lives, a quiet light that never fades.